This week I'm in the kitchen, hopefully cooking up a storm, but how do we eat well and cut emissions? Hello and welcome to the programme. This week we are looking at food. It is responsible for around a third of our emissions, so greening our diet is essential if we're going to reach net zero. But most people don't want to be told to go vegan, for instance, so what can we do? Also on the programme, I speak with Professor Jim Skee, the man from Dundee who's just been elected to head up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. After the by-election result in Uxbridge, are Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer about to backtrack on green policies? And would it be a vote winner? And a nature reserve by accident, how this London wilderness is now threatened with being tamed. But first, we've become used to calorie scores for our food. Here at Sky in the canteen, it's listed on the board. Next to, and this is new, a carbon score also displayed. Many people say that information should become commonplace, but would it change what you eat? Since January, the chefs at Sky have been labelling menus with a traffic light system and actual numbers showing the carbon intensity of each dish. With nearly 30,000 employees across 5 sites, there's a lot of mouths to feed. The employer is one of many across the private and public sector hoping to cut carbon from catering. So I'm your sous chef. Tilly, tell me what to do. What am I preparing and why?
Okay, brilliant. So today we're going to be doing, a showcase of British beetroot.
Since setting up the project, Sky's emissions from food have reduced by a quarter, but a large proportion of that is actually the chefs making greener menu choices.
We're seeing carbon reduced throughout our menus, and that's across the different restaurants and across the estate.
But is that because of what you've done or what the customers have chosen?
So predominantly it's what we've done. It's much easier for us to influence our chefs than it is for us to influence our customers.
But before you can label a meal, you need to work out what's actually gone into it. Anya's company makes carbon calculations.
So when we have a meal, the first thing we start with is the ingredients that go into that meal. And what we're trying to do is look across the whole life cycle of those food items, so from farm to fork, and that includes everything from farming, processing, packaging, transportation, cooking. So it's quite a lot to take into account when you're calculating the impact. And what we do for the farming stages and transportation is we have thousands of scientific studies that will look at the impact of growing lots of different crops and different types of animals. And then we'll do things like look at the country of origin, so calculate the transportation distances, and then also how long that food is cooked for, so what kind of gas or electricity might have gone into that, and then finally the food waste. So it's quite a big picture.
But why don't big caterers like this just take everything that's really bad for the environment off the menu?
We supply a really big variety of people. So there's people with different religious aspects to what they eat, so different dietary requirements, different allergens, different cost perspectives. So we have to bear all of that in mind, not just carbon. So if we decide to take all meat off the menu, that could impact people negatively. So we have to consider lots of things, not just the carbon. Was it also a feeling that it's not necessarily a role to dictate in that way? There is that as well. We want to make sure we're sort of persuading and gently nudging and educating rather than forcing people into a choice. We tried to move chips off the menu once up north and people walked out because that's what they want, and that's fine. We've got to give people what they want. The approach used here of giving a score to the food is all about giving customers or chefs choice. But there is another approach to making food more climate friendly, which is about limiting choice, saying it's only vegan or only from close by or has no waste. Talking of which, I'm not going to waste this. Not bad. Nearly 320 million meals are thrown away by restaurants and cafes in the UK every year. In fact, food waste is responsible for around half of the global food system's emissions.
Many years of owning a zero waste restaurant, cooking for 300 to 400 diners a week. We have summed a grand total of this much waste.
To limit years of waste to something the size of a brick has led Doug and his restaurant in East London to make necessity the mother of invention.
So this is post-industrial plastic, and this is the trimmings from Italian leather shoes. This is a treacle made from veg waste. Every section in the kitchen has a collection of veg waste, and then we cook it all down into this syrup.
That is really sweet.
It's amazing, isn't it? This is where we turn our single-use waste glass into things that we need. So it goes through this machine here, and out comes really beautiful fine glass sand. Now what we do is we put it into the kiln like this, and out pops a glass plate. We're turning all of our surplus that would have otherwise been wasted into incredible umami fermentations. Now the key ingredient is koji. This is what makes it taste so good. It's umami, and it closes the loop on all of our surplus waste.
So it's a cupboard full of extraordinary flavour from what would have otherwise been waste.
Yep, absolutely. Would you like to try my cultivated fungus?
Unlike chefs at Sky and many other caterers who provide numbers so diners can make a climate-friendly choice, in Doug's place he has chosen the rules, and less choice on the menu is one of them.
Within the kitchen, your skill level with less things is higher because you're more focused on that thing that you're preparing. So the quality is inevitably going to be higher, and the efficiency is going to be higher, and the waste is going to significantly be reduced because there is no way a chef can predict what the customers are going to order. So by reducing that option, we're reducing the waste.
The government's recent net zero review recommended standardised and widespread eco-labelling within 2 years. If that happens, it could take a bite out of climate change.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the enormously influential grouping of scientists under the UN who look at the latest climate science and produce reports. Those reports are very influential on government, not least at the annual climate summits, these COPs you hear about, which take place across the world. Now, they've just elected a new chair, and that is Professor Jim Skee from Imperial College here in London, and I'm pleased to say that he's joining us on the line from Nairobi. Well, Jim Skee, first of all, congratulations. Quite a task in front of you. Could say saving the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's the size of it. So I woke up the morning after the election and I just realised the enormity of the job I'd taken on. So I'm up to it, I have to say that.
Now, how are you going to approach this? How are you going to achieve perhaps greater success and penetration from the IPCC than it's had of late?
Well, I mean, I think the IPCC has actually had a pretty big impact. If you remember 5 years ago, we produced that special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, which really had an absolutely huge influence. It really brought the idea of net zero to the world. And, so many countries around the world now have net zero targets. So we know we're having an impact and we really need to keep that up.
How is the IPCC going to help or try and drive that further? I mean, is it still about emphasising the threat? Mr. Gutierrez talking about boiling now rather than just warming. Is there an approach change needed?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that we are actually very careful to do, because the gloomy and the apocalyptic messages that can be taken out of the IPCC reports, it does worry us that these can be very disempowering, that there's nothing I can do about it. So one of the things that we actually worked quite strongly in the report that I was helped to produce in the last cycle on reducing emissions was to point out the positive and to point out the successes. If we had not acted already, emissions would be maybe 5-10% higher than they actually are now. We want to continue, I think, to emphasize these positive messages.
So do you think the language of peril, like Antonio Gutierrez talking about the Earth now boiling, can put people off?
Well, I mean, what I would say, the Secretary General has a very different mandate from IPCC, and he can say things like that. I can promise you global boiling would never get past an approval session in IPCC, past 190 governments. So by our nature, we have to you have more measures.
Sounds like you're a bit unhappy with it, Jim, as a term.
It wouldn't pass my lips, except when you ask me to comment on it. Let me put it that way.
Now, a lot of people are viewing your appointment as a chance for the UK to show renewed leadership in climate circles. What do our politicians need to do to regain that leadership position, which lots of people say they've lost?
I don't think the UK is that different from other countries. It does need a stepping up of effort on the ground if we're actually going to achieve the goals that were set in the Paris Agreement.
Do you not share some of the frustration that we saw some great language and some determination from the UK following Glasgow COP26, and that seems to have evaporated a bit, and that's disappointing, isn't it?
Well, I think all across in the world, I mean, the message that we came up with is that the current policies that people have in place will absolutely not allow us to meet the Paris goals. In fact, if we carry on as we are with current policies, the world could warm by up to 3 degrees by the end of this century. So there's a very, very clear message, and obviously, scientists are not only IPCC authors, they're human beings with their own views. And I think it would be fair to say that many scientists would have that frustration, certainly.
Is 3 degrees a civilization threat, in effect?
I doubt it would be the end of human civilization completely as we know it. For small island developing states, for example, in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, we are looking at existential threats of 3 degrees warming. But human civilization as a whole, I think there is still hope.
But forgive me, Jim, people in this country listening to that who, let's say might be a bit selfish, might say, well, even 3 degrees, which is in higher extremes, it's not going to be that bad here. Why should I change? Why should I worry? Why should I pressure my politicians?
Well, I mean, there are still a set of issues. I'm not saying there's an existential threat, but it is absolutely a worse world.
We had a really interesting interview last week on the show with the petroleum minister from South Sudan, who was basically saying to us, we need investment to avoid poverty. And he said, what would you rather people die of? Poverty today or maybe climate change in a few years down the line? I mean, it's a difficult dilemma, that. What do you think?
If you take all the oil and gas and coal reserves that we have in the world, if we were to exploit them all as they are at the moment, we would exceed the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees warming. So there's a very clear message that perhaps there is a choice to be made at the global level about whose reserves are actually going to be exploited.
Maybe poorer countries should be allowed to exploit their reserves. You know what you're saying?
Yeah, that is certainly something for politicians to think about in international negotiations. We can provide the advice that it is very hard to reconcile 1.5 degrees warming with the full exploitation of existing oil, gas and coal reserves and any further additions. But it's kind of for the politicians to make sense of that and figure out where they want to put their choices.
Now, as action to combat climate change stutters, we've seen temperature records broken. July is very likely to be the hottest month ever, while June was the hottest June ever. And at the same time as the wildfires in the Mediterranean, we've seen the waters of that sea rise to record temperatures too.
And seas off Florida touched hot tub temperature, 38 degrees, with local wildlife conservationists in the Florida Keys reporting a complete wipeout of one of the reefs they've been attempting to conserve, with everything bleached. And on the other side of the globe, a lack of Antarctic sea ice is sending a chill. The data from satellite observations goes back about 40 years, and these are the readings showing the amount of ice present in each of those years. This line here is last year, 2022, which recorded the lowest on record, until now that is. Here is 2023 so far, substantially below anything ever seen to date.
This is a really unforeseen event. So since the records began back in the 70s, the Antarctic sea ice has actually been relatively steady, and if anything, maybe even expanding a little bit each year. But now, and since 2016, we really do see the Antarctic sea ice entering what appears to be a declining phase.
While scientists are cautious to definitively blame climate change for the shift, they concede that what we are seeing is consistent with models showing how human-driven warming will impact the southern ice cap. It also raises the fear of feedback loops fueling further warming, with less ice reflecting less of the sun's heat.
So we'll have a lot more open water. Open water absorbs heat a lot more efficiently than water that's capped off with a cover of sea ice. So there could be potentially long-term repercussions for this. We may not see the sea ice recover in several years or even at all.
Sobering stuff, and one of many indicators of how rapidly things are changing. We're off to a break now, but when we come back, we'll be at London's Accidental Nature Reserve and talking about the fight to save it. Welcome back to the show. Now, it's been a week of confusion surrounding the commitment of both major parties to their green policies, following an unlikely Conservative win in the by-election in Uxbridge, which was Boris Johnson's old seat.
And I hereby declare that the said Steve Tuckwell is duly elected.
The thorny topic of the expansion of London's ultra-low emission zone by London's Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan dominated the contest. It penalises drivers of older, more polluting vehicles and is popular across much of the city, but much less so in the outer suburbs like Uxbridge, where more people drive and there's less public transport. Sir Keir Starmer has been accused of going cold on Labour's ambitious climate agenda in recent weeks, and after the result, he blamed ULEZ for the loss and urged the mayor to reflect on the result.
In an election, policy matters. And we are doing something very wrong if policies put forward by the Labour Party end up on each and every Tory leaflet.
Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined by Craig Oliver, who was Director of Communications for Number 10 when David Cameron was Prime Minister. Craig, I'm baffled. Opinion polls seem to suggest that action on environment and climate change is popular, and yet the party leadership seem to be scarpering in the other direction. What's going on?
I think in the medium to long term, there's a broad consensus in British politics that we need to get to net zero. We need to find a way to tackle climate change. We're the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, depending on how you measure it, and we're going to try and contribute to doing that. But in the short term, you've got to get yourself elected. And I think what happened with the Uxbridge by-election, with a lot of people got spooked by a result that they probably shouldn't have been.
I've seen politicians saying, I support action on climate change unless it costs us money. Well, I stood back and thought, well, that's infantile. You know, lots of things we have to do cost us money. Fighting inflation, defending the country, you know, having a health service, you know.
Well, it's not just costing the country money in that the government has to pay money towards it. I think what they're really saying is we're nervous about hitting people in their pockets. We've got a cost of living crisis going on at the moment. And if you are in a situation where you're going to have to pay £12.50 extra a day just to drive your old car, that's going to cause a lot of people a lot of pain. And that's going to cause a lot of people say, well, what are you doing for me? I'm afraid that pain is going to be real for a lot of people going forward. And if we are going to do this generational shift to a green economy, if we are actually going to combat climate change, there is going to be pain. But I think that the politicians are very, very nervous about sharing that with the general public.
But do you think, therefore, they should be painting in a different way, a bit more like they have in the States, whereas you actually sort of paint the bright new future that you could be getting to with the green jobs, with the opportunity here, rather than the threat?
Well, to a point, because I think somebody would say, well, look, that's all very well, but at the moment I'm paying an extra 300 quid a month just to drive my car. So they'll have problems with that. They'll say, hang on a minute, this is hitting me in the pocket.
Yeah,
now.
but these are very narrow, and you talk about the £300 of the car. That isn't actually the majority of people. That's a small number of people.
No, it's not the majority of people, but enough people to make them worried and concerned. And so painting the big, bright future for somebody when they're feeling pain is very difficult. I accept that. I understand that. I've been in politics. If you've got people saying, look, you are hurting me in my pocket, that's very difficult.
I return to this puzzle of why our politics doesn't seem to be addressing this problem when we've got record temperatures and fires in the Mediterranean, lots of scientists stressing urgency, you know, Guterres talking about, you know, boiling rather than warming, and you know, green energy being cheap, and yet
Yeah.
the leadership still seem to be afraid.
No, I totally agree with you. The problem for politicians is they say, that's all very well for you, I've got to get elected next year. And if people are saying to me, I'm more worried about the pound in my pocket than I am about climate change, that's a problem. And that means that politicians need to explain to them that the pound in their pocket will be hit even more if they don't do something about it.
So, just to be clear, do you think the leaderships are right in electoral terms to be going soft on the green policies?
No. I don't. The reason I don't, I can understand the argument that if in a short-term world where we're not making the case, where we're not fighting, where we're not arguing, where we're not educating, people will always push back. I find it very, very hard to hear the Labour Party talking for the last 2 years about a green economy, or Rishi Sunak talking about net zero, and to then come out and claim that somehow it can all be done without the average person having to shift and change and have issues. This is not something that is going to happen without impacting real people. We need to do it in a way that protects people. We need to worry about the fact that people are struggling with the cost of living. We need to find a way through that. But this is the biggest problem facing mankind. It is existential. It is a huge issue. And if politicians back off because they didn't win a seat by a few hundred votes that they have never won, then it doesn't bode very well for the future. And I think history will judge politicians very, very poorly if it looks back and said, look, you had an opportunity to stand firm here and you didn't. You had an opportunity to educate here and you didn't.
Craig Oliver, thanks very much indeed. Now we're going to hear from a place not very far from here that has become an accidental nature hotspot, land that was abandoned, but now the council wants to build on it. Our very own Mickey Carroll has been there.
Ealing Council want to build a sports centre. The problem is they want to build it here. Until a decade ago, all of this was a bustling place for the community of Southall to come and do their sports. But then it fell into disrepair and nature took over.
We have skylarks nesting here, a quarter of London's population currently nest here. We have barn owls, we have linnets, we have slow worms, these lovely, beautiful golden creatures. We have hedgehogs. Honestly, this place is just an incredible site for wildlife.
Now the council wants it back to construct a sports centre for the people of Southall.
Warren Farm was a sports centre from the 1960s all up until about a decade ago, when the local community lost it as a real important community asset. And that's a community that's predominantly British Asian, with the highest levels of hypertension, diabetes and heart disease, and some of the lowest levels of physical activity.
But the volunteers say it's impossible to build anything here without impacting the rare ecosystem that has sprung up.
We're not against sports by any stretch. Sports are really important. But what we are saying is you can't destroy really valuable habitats such as this.
Amateur photographer Julian Oliver spends his time snapping wildlife on Warren Farm.
To get the opportunity to be here and do that and help out as well, because I'm sure everything I find here helps us have a chance of saving this place, which, would be a travesty if we lost it.
After years of battling, a controversial compromise the council have reached is to only build on part of the land and to designate the rest of the site as a nature reserve. Although London has more green space than any other major city in Europe, wild spots like this are rarer and they're hugely important for biodiversity. More manicured parks do host birds and insects, but it's things like overgrown thickets and long grass that help rare species thrive. As the UK is trying to build back its wildlife, construction projects like this will need to learn how to coexist with nature. Mickey Carroll, Ealing, Sky News.
It's amazing how quickly nature can reclaim some of our abandoned spaces, but as we saw, that throws up dilemmas. That's it for this week. You can keep across all your climate and environment news on the Sky News website and app, or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen right now. Next week, I'll be looking at the extraordinary explosion in the numbers of birds of prey, but the threats they face as a result. See you then.